My grandfather casually mentioned gifting me a $500,000 property while carving the Thanksgiving turkey. I had been living in poverty while my mother secretly collected the rent, so I hired a forensic accountant and completely destroyed her perfect life. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Kin and Karma. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. My bank account was overdrawn by $42, and my head felt like it was packed with cotton. I had been fighting a relentless, chest-rattling flu for 2 weeks, unable to afford a proper doctor's visit, relying instead on over-the-counter syrup that tasted like copper and regret. Every time I coughed, a sharp pain radiated down my ribs. This was my reality as a 28-year-old freelance illustrator, desperately trying to piece together a living in a city that charged for the air you breathed. And yet, despite the fever chills racking my body, I was sitting at the sprawling mahogany dining table in my mother's immaculate, multi-million-dollar home for Thanksgiving. The contrast was physically nauseating. Evelyn, my mother, sat at the head of the table on the opposite end, radiant in a tailored emerald silk blouse that likely cost more than my rent for a year. Her blonde hair was perfectly blown out, falling over her shoulders in gentle, practiced waves. She was laughing brightly at a joke made by one of her wealthy socialite friends who had joined us for the holiday. The crystal goblets on the table caught the light from the custom chandelier above, casting fractured rainbows across the spread of artisanal cheeses, imported caviar, and a turkey that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. I pulled my threadbare, oversized cardigan tighter around my shivering shoulders, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was just trying to survive the night. I needed the leftovers I knew I'd get to take home. They would feed me for a week. "Eva, darling, you look positively dreadful," my mother chimed from across the table, her voice slicing through the low hum of conversation. Her tone was draped in faux concern, but her eyes, cold and assessing, swept over my pale face and unruly hair with clear disdain. "Are you making sure to take your vitamins? Honestly, the bohemian artist lifestyle is really taking its toll on your complexion." I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing a weak smile. "I'm just a little under the weather, Mom. I'll be fine." "Well, please don't breathe on the stuffing," she replied, taking a delicate sip of her vintage Pinot Noir. A few of her guests chuckled politely. I felt the familiar sting of humiliation burn in my cheeks, but I kept my gaze trained on my porcelain plate. Then the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open, and my grandfather Andrew walked in. He was 82, retired from a brilliant career as an architect, and the only genuine person in this entire hollow house. He walked with a silver-tipped cane, his posture still commanding, his bright blue eyes sharp and unwavering. He took his seat next to me, giving my trembling hand a warm, reassuring squeeze. "Don't let her get to you, Eva," he murmured softly under his breath, his voice a gravelly rumble that immediately brought tears to my eyes. "You work harder than anyone I know." After the meal had been served, the moment came that happened every year. Grandfather Andrew reached into the breast pocket of his tweed blazer and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. He slid it across the white linen tablecloth toward me. "A little something to help with your art supplies, sweetheart," he said kindly. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a check for $200. To my mother's wealthy friends, it was pocket change. To me, it was a lifeline. It meant groceries. It meant I could turn my radiator back on for the rest of the month. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, my voice thick with genuine emotion. I looked up at him, smiling softly. "This means so much to me. I really appreciate it." Grandfather Andrew froze. The ornate silver carving knife in his hand hovered inches above the remains of the turkey. He turned his head slowly, his thick white eyebrows knitting together in profound confusion. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The entire table seemed to quiet down, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "Eva," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its gentle warmth and taking on a serious, hard edge. "What do you mean, $200? "The check, Grandpa," I replied, suddenly nervous, holding up the slip of paper. "It's for $200. It's very generous." "I haven't written you a check for $200 in 5 years, he interrupted, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous dining room. He set the carving knife down with a sharp clack against the platter. He leaned forward, looking me straight in the eye. "Eva, the gift I gave you, 5 years ago when I retired, was $500,000 worth of commercial property downtown." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy silence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process the words. $500,000. Property. My eyes darted instinctively to the head of the table. My mother's face had turned completely, horrifyingly pale. The rosy blush on her cheeks vanished, leaving her skin the color of ash. The wine glass in her hand trembled so violently that the red liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white tablecloth like a splash of fresh blood. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I sat there, shivering in my cheap, worn-out sweater, the $200 check crinkling in my clammy hand. I thought of the nights I had cried myself to sleep from hunger. I thought of the agonizing stress, the overwhelming debt, the constant, grinding fear of eviction. And I looked at my mother's terrified, guilty eyes. The betrayal was worse than the poverty itself. The rest of the dinner was a blur of frantic, damage control chaos orchestrated entirely by Evelyn. The moment the words had left Grandfather Andrew's mouth, the illusion of the perfect Thanksgiving shattered into a million jagged pieces. Evelyn abruptly slammed her wine glass down, the crystal base cracking against the mahogany table. "Dad!" She practically shrieked, her voice pitching up an octave into a shrill, hysterical tone. "What on earth are you talking about? You're confusing things again. Your memory has been so terrible lately, we've talked about this." She looked around at her guests, forcing a manic, strained laugh. "Oh, the mind plays such cruel tricks on the elderly, doesn't it? He's getting his investments completely mixed up with little Eva's birthday gifts." Grandfather Andrew's jaw tightened. "My memory is as sharp as a tack, Evelyn," he growled, standing up slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. He glared down the length of the table at her. "I transferred the deed to the Oak Street commercial complex into Eva's name on her 23rd birthday. I signed the paperwork in my attorney's office. You were supposed to deliver the finalized portfolio to her because she was out of state at the time." Evelyn was hyperventilating now, her hands fluttering wildly as if she could wave the truth away. "You're confused. You never did any such thing. Eva, don't listen to him, he needs to lie down. Come, let's clear the plates." She aggressively began grabbing plates from her bewildered guests, her manicured fingers digging into the porcelain. Grandfather Andrew looked at me, his eyes full of sorrow and a dawning, terrible realization. "Eva," he whispered, "have you not been receiving the monthly rent from the commercial tenants?" "Rent," I choked out, my chest tightening. "Grandpa, I don't own any property, I never signed anything, I don't have any portfolio." Evelyn dropped a stack of plates. They shattered against the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. "That is enough," she screamed, all pretenses of the elegant hostess completely vanishing. "Dinner is over. Everyone, I am so sorry, but my father is having a medical episode. Please, you must leave." She ushered the confused, murmuring guests out of the house with aggressive haste. Grandfather Andrew, looking pale and suddenly exhausted, was escorted to the guest bedroom by the housekeeper. I stood frozen in the dining room, my mind reeling. A property. Rent. 5 years. I calculated it in my head. If it was a $500,000 commercial space, the monthly rental income would have been thousands of dollars. Tens of thousands of dollars over 5 years. While I was choosing between buying antibiotics or paying my electric bill, there was a small fortune with my name on it out there. And my mother had intercepted it. I wandered numbly into the massive, marble-countered kitchen, needing a glass of water to soothe my burning throat. Before I could even reach the faucet, Evelyn stormed into the room, slamming the swinging door shut behind her. She looked unhinged. The perfectly coiffed hair was now slightly frayed, and her eyes were wild. She cornered me against the kitchen island, pointing a perfectly manicured finger inches from my face. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," she hissed, her voice venomous, stripped of any maternal warmth. "You are going to drop this, do you hear me? Your grandfather is senile. He's losing his mind. There is no property. There is no money. And if you dare try to upset him further with your pathetic greed, I will cut you out of my life permanently. I will make sure you don't see a dime of my inheritance." "He wasn't confused, Mom," I said, my voice trembling, though not from the flu anymore. A deep, unfamiliar anger was beginning to bubble up in my chest. He was incredibly specific. Oak Street. Evelyn's hand flew out and gripped my upper arm, her nails digging painfully into my skin through my sweater. I said, "Drop it. You have no idea how things work in the real world, Eva. You just sit in your little apartment drawing your little pictures. I manage the family's finances. I ensure we all stay afloat. You have nothing without me. Remember that." She shoved me back slightly and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of her mansion. I leaned against the marble counter, rubbing my arm. My mother was terrifying when she felt cornered. She was a master of gaslighting, of twisting reality until you felt crazy for ever questioning her. For my entire life, I had backed down. I had folded. I had believed her lies because it was easier than fighting the storm. But as I stood there, looking out the kitchen window at her pristine, half-acre landscaped garden, the anger solidified into something hard and sharp. She had stolen from me. She had watched me starve, watched me struggle, and smiled while she deposited my money into her account. She thought I would just cower and accept her version of reality, as I always had. But she had forgotten one crucial thing. My best friend, Alexa, wasn't just my confidant. She was the most ruthless paralegal at a premier real estate law firm in the city, and I already had my phone in my hand. The train ride back to my tiny, drafty apartment felt like it took hours. I stared blankly out the smeared window at the passing city lights, my mind flooded with memories that were rapidly changing context. For as long as I could remember, Evelyn had conditioned me to believe that I owed her my absolute devotion. When I was 19, she went through what she dramatically called her financial dark period, after a messy breakup with a wealthy boyfriend. I had dropped out of my first semester of art school, drained the meager savings account I had built from working retail, and handed it all over to her to keep the lights on in her luxury condo. She told me it was what family did. Even after I moved out, she maintained a stranglehold on my sense of guilt. I ran her errands. I dog-sat her purebred poodles. I spent hours listening to her complain about the stress of her life, while I secretly worried about how I was going to afford groceries that week. I worshipped her resilience, her ability to bounce back and eventually buy the multi-million-dollar house she lived in now. I never questioned where her sudden resurgence of wealth came from. Evelyn always described her profession as luxury real estate consulting. It sounded impressive, but whenever I asked her what she actually did on a day-to-day basis, her answers were remarkably vague. "I connect high-net-worth individuals with off-market opportunities. Eva, it's very complex," she would say, waving her hand dismissively. She had no office. She had no official website. She spent her days at the country club, getting chemical peels and hosting lavish luncheons. Now, the horrifying truth was clicking into place. Her off-market opportunity was me. Her high-net-worth individual was my grandfather. I remembered a conversation we had just last month. I had asked her to borrow $50 to cover a prescription. I was desperate. She had invited me to a cafe, arrived carrying a brand-new $10,000 Birkin bag, and sighed heavily as she slid two $20 bills and a 10 across the table. "You really need to figure out a real career, Eva," she had told me, sipping a $6 latte. "This whole starving artist phase is getting pathetic. It's draining on me to constantly bail you out. You need to learn how to generate real, passive income, like I do." She had sat there, clutching a $10,000 bag, lecturing me about financial responsibility, while actively siphoning the passive income that legally belonged to me. The sheer, audacious cruelty of it took my breath away. Evelyn was obsessed with appearances. Her entire identity was tied to being perceived as wealthy, successful, and superior. The Oak Street property wasn't just money to her. It was the fuel for the illusion she projected to the world. And she had shown a bizarre, inappropriate interest in Grandfather Andrew's assets for years. Whenever he visited, she would subtly try to interrogate him about his will, his portfolio, and his estate planning, always masking it as daughterly concern. She had seen an opportunity when I was young, naive, and out of state. She had seen an asset, intercepted the paperwork, and likely forged whatever documents were necessary to redirect the income stream into an LLC she controlled. She assumed I was too financially illiterate and too blindly obedient to ever uncover the truth. I unlocked the door to my studio apartment. The air inside was freezing. The landlord hadn't fixed the radiator yet. I didn't take off my coat. I sat down at my small, wobbly desk, booted up my outdated laptop, and pulled out my phone. I opened my text thread with Alexa. Emergency, I typed, my fingers cold and stiff. My mom stole a $500,000 commercial property from me 5 years ago. I need your help. I need a forensic accountant and the meanest lawyer your firm has. The reply came less than a minute later. Alexa, holy shit, don't say another word to her. I'm coming over right now. Put the kettle on. I set the phone down. The fever was still burning in my veins, but the crushing weight of depression and helplessness was gone. In its place was a cold, razor-sharp focus. Evelyn had spent my entire life making me feel small, incompetent, and dependent. She had used my love and loyalty as weapons against me. But she was about to learn that you should never push someone who has nothing left to lose. The passive, obedient daughter died at that Thanksgiving table. I was going to take back what was mine, and I was going to tear down the fraudulent, luxurious empire she had built on my back, brick by stolen brick. I stared at the glowing screen of Alexa's laptop, the harsh blue light casting long, skeletal shadows against the peeling paint of my apartment walls. Alexa had arrived 20 minutes after my text, armed with 2 giant coffees, a thick manila folder, and a look of absolute, terrifying determination. She hadn't even bothered to take off her wool trench coat. The freezing temperature of my apartment was entirely ignored in the face of our mission. Okay, Alexa said, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the speed of a court reporter. In my state, property transfers are public record. You just have to know which municipal database to dig through, and thankfully, I do this for a living. I wrapped my hands around the hot coffee cup, the warmth slowly seeping into my numb fingers. I still don't understand how she could have done it. Grandpa said he signed it over to me. How did she get it in her name? We're about to find out, Alexa murmured, her eyes darting back and forth across the screen. Oak Street Commercial Complex. Andrew, here we go. 5 years ago. Transfer of deed. She clicked a button and a scanned PDF document filled the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Look at the grantee, Alexa instructed, pointing a manicured finger at the screen. I leaned in. The document named the new owner not as Eva, but as an entity, Golden Oak Holdings, LLC. An LLC, I whispered, the reality of the premeditation sinking in. She hadn't just kept a check. She had created a corporate shield. Exactly, Alexa said, her jaw tight. And who is the registered managing member of Golden Oak Holdings, LLC? Let's check the state registry. She opened a new tab, typed rapidly, and hit enter. Bingo, Evelyn. The name sat there on the screen, a digital monument to my mother's boundless greed. But wait, I said, my brow furrowing as I looked back at the first document. For Grandpa to transfer it to an LLC instead of me, he would have had to sign off on that specific name. Or, if he transferred it to me first, I would have had to sign the deed over to the LLC. Scroll down to the signatures. Alexa scrolled to the final page of the deed transfer. There, next to my grandfather's shaky but distinct cursive, was another signature. Eva. She forged it, Alexa gasped, leaning back in her chair. She actually committed felony forgery. I stared at the signature. To a bank teller or a clerk, it would look perfect. But Evelyn had forgotten one crucial thing, my profession. I didn't just write my name, I drew it. I spent 10 hours a day studying line weight, stroke velocity, and pen pressure. It's a tracing, I said, my voice eerily calm. I pointed to the screen. Look at the V. The line weight is entirely uniform. When you write naturally, the pressure changes on the downstroke. This has zero variation. It's hesitant. Someone put a piece of paper over my actual signature, likely on a light box, and traced it with a micron pen. I closed my eyes, a sickening memory washing over me. 5 years ago, just before my birthday, she asked me to sign a stack of blank thank you cards for her to send to her clients. She said her wrist was acting up. I signed 30 blank cards for her. Alexa looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. Eva, that's brilliant. Your illustration background is our golden ticket. A handwriting expert will tear this apart in 5 minutes. She pulled her phone from her pocket. I'm calling Marcus. He's a forensic accountant I work with on massive corporate divorce cases. He loves tearing down fake empires. Can we afford him? I asked, looking around my dismal apartment. Marcus takes a percentage of recovered stolen assets when the fraud is this obvious, Alexa smiled, a sharp, predatory grin. And honey, we are going to recover everything. The next morning, I didn't bother calling before I went to my grandfather's townhouse. I knew Evelyn would be there. After the disaster at Thanksgiving, she would be hovering over him like a vulture, desperately trying to do damage control and ensure he didn't speak to anyone else. I let myself in with the spare key he had given me years ago. The house was quiet, smelling of lemon polish and old leather. I walked down the hallway toward his study, the heavy oak doors slightly ajar. It's just a misunderstanding, Dad, I heard my mother's voice, smooth and dripping with fabricated patience. You know how the medication makes you confused. You set up a trust for her, that's all. I've been managing it perfectly. I pushed the doors open. Grandfather Andrew was sitting in his leather armchair by the window, looking exhausted and infinitely older than he had just 24 hours prior. Evelyn was standing over him, holding a silver tray with a cup of tea and 2 white pills. They both snapped their heads toward the door as I walked in. Eva, Evelyn said, her voice instantly hardening, the sickly sweet tone vanishing. What are you doing here? I told you your grandfather needs rest. He is not up for visitors. I'm not a visitor, Mom. I'm his granddaughter, I said, stepping fully into the room and planting my feet firmly on the Persian rug. I looked directly at my grandfather. Grandpa, how are you feeling? I'm fine, Eva, he sighed, pushing the tray of pills away. Just trying to sort through this mess. Your mother says there's a trust. There is no trust, Grandpa, I said, keeping my voice steady, though my heart was pounding furiously against my ribs. I turned my gaze to Evelyn. She was glaring at me, her eyes shooting invisible daggers. Eva, I am warning you, Evelyn hissed, taking a step toward me. Do not do this. You are mentally unstable. You've always been prone to these hysterical episodes. She looked back at Andrew. Dad, she's having one of her episodes. I need to call her doctor. I don't have a doctor, Mom, because I don't have health insurance, I replied coldly. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the single sheet of paper Alexa had printed for me. I held it up. Evelyn, do you know what Golden Oak Holdings, LLC is? The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The color completely drained from Evelyn's face, leaving her looking hollow and skeletal. The silver tray in her hands shook so violently the teacup rattled against the saucer. Where did you hear that name? She demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper. It's public record, I said, stepping closer to her. It's the company you created to steal the Oak Street property. The company where you forged my signature on the deed transfer. Forged, Grandfather Andrew shouted, gripping the arms of his chair, pulling himself upright. Evelyn, what is she talking about? Evelyn completely lost control. The polished, elegant society woman vanished, replaced by a cornered, vicious animal. She slammed the silver tray down onto the mahogany desk, spilling hot tea across the polished wood. You little bitch. She screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. You ungrateful, parasitic little bitch. You think you're so smart. You think you can just waltz in here and ruin my life. I gave you everything. I birthed you. I clothed you. You stole from me. I yelled back, the years of suppressed anger finally detonating. You watched me starve while you bought designer bags with my rent money. It was my money. She shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at my face. He should have given it to me. I am the one who takes care of this family. You are a useless scribbler. You would have squandered it. I protected that asset. By stealing it, Grandfather Andrew bellowed, his voice echoing with the authority of a judge. He was staring at Evelyn as if he were looking at a stranger, a monster wearing his daughter's skin. Evelyn spun around, pointing her finger at him now. Oh, shut up, you old fool. You were going to hand $500,000 to a child who can't even pay her own phone bill. I did what had to be done. And if either of you tries to take this to the police, I will tell them you are both delusional. I have friends in the courts. I will have you committed, Eva. I will destroy you. She grabbed her coat from the sofa and stormed out of the study, slamming the heavy oak doors behind her with such force the framed architectural blueprints on the walls rattled. The aftermath of that confrontation was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Within an hour, my phone began blowing up with text messages from Evelyn. You are dead to me. You will never see a dime of my inheritance. I have already contacted my lawyer. You will be sued for defamation. Grandpa is severely ill. If the stress of your lies kills him, it will be your fault. I didn't reply to a single one. I forwarded every message directly to Alexa. Meanwhile, Grandfather Andrew was struggling. The emotional toll of realizing his own daughter was a thief was destroying him. He called me that evening, his voice weak and frail. Eva, he whispered through the phone. Evelyn called me. She was crying. She said she only put it in an LLC to protect you from taxes. She said she was saving the money for you in a separate account. Maybe we should just look at the accounts before we do anything drastic. My heart broke for him. Even after witnessing her monstrous outburst, a father's instinct is to believe the best of his child. She was banking on his love and his failing energy to wear him down. She was trying to drag him back into the fog. Grandpa, I said gently but firmly. If she was saving it for me, why did I have to beg her for $50 to buy medicine last month? He went silent on the other end of the line. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. I don't know, Eva. I don't want the family to be destroyed. She already destroyed it, Grandpa, I told him. We are just cleaning up the wreckage. The next afternoon, the wreckage became undeniably catastrophic. I was sitting in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Alexa's law firm. Marcus, the forensic accountant, walked in holding a massive 3-ring binder. He was a quiet, intense man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, but his eyes were bright with the thrill of the hunt. You were right to move fast, Marcus said, dropping the heavy binder onto the glass table with a resounding thud. Your mother is panicking. She's trying to move assets around, but she's sloppy. What did you find? Alexa asked, leaning forward, her pen poised over a legal pad. The rent theft is the least of her crimes, Marcus said, opening the binder to a page filled with highlighted bank statements. Evelyn didn't just collect the rent. 2 years ago, she used Golden Oak Holdings to take out a commercial line of credit against the equity of the Oak Street property. The air in the room vanished. Alone, I choked out, how much? $250,000, Marcus replied grimly. And she didn't reinvest a single penny of it into the property. I tracked the routing numbers. The loan disbursements were funneled directly through the LLC into her personal checking account. She used it to pay off credit cards, fund a trip to Milan, and he flipped a page. Purchase a custom-ordered Mercedes SUV. I felt physically ill. She hadn't just stolen my income. She had placed a massive $250,000 debt on a property that legally belonged to me. If she defaulted, the bank would seize it. We need to show this to Andrew immediately, Alexa stated, her voice pure steel. He's wavering. He needs to see the absolute, undeniable proof before she convinces him to sign a power of attorney over his own assets. We arranged the meeting for the very next morning at the law firm, a neutral, intimidating environment where Evelyn couldn't just barge in. Grandfather Andrew arrived in a town car we sent for him, leaning heavily on his cane, looking as though he had aged 10 years in 3 days. We sat him down in the plush leather chair at the head of the conference table. Marcus opened the binder. He didn't use legal jargon, he used undeniable facts. He showed Grandfather Andrew the traced, forged signature on the deed transfer. He showed him the state registry proving Evelyn was the sole controller of the LLC. And then he showed him the bank statements. "Andrew," Marcus said gently, sliding a highlighted document across the glass. "This is a transfer of $50,000 from the property's credit line, routed directly to Evelyn's personal American Express card. The memo line on the credit card statement lists purchases from Chanel, Cartier, and a luxury med spa." Grandfather Andrew stared at the paper. His trembling fingers reached out, hovering over the highlighted numbers. He traced the digits, his breath hitching in his chest. For 5 minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock and the ragged sound of an old man's heart breaking. Finally, he looked up. The confusion, the denial, the paternal hope, it was all gone. His blue eyes were flinty, sharp, and terrifyingly cold. "She has stolen from my granddaughter. She has defrauded me, and she has disgraced our name," Grandfather Andrew said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He looked at Alexa. "What do we do now to destroy her?" Evelyn's arrogance was, ultimately, her fatal flaw. She operated under the unshakable delusion that she was the smartest person in any room, and that the rest of us were simply supporting characters in the grand, luxurious movie of her life. She was so confident in her ability to manipulate reality that she didn't cancel her annual winter charity gala. A lavish event she hosted at the city's most exclusive country club every December to cement her status among the wealthy elite. It was the perfect stage, and she had no idea we were coming. The country club's grand ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the sea of silk dresses, tailored tuxedos, and exorbitant floral arrangements. A string quartet played softly in the corner, entirely drowned out by the clinking of champagne flutes and the hollow laughter of the city's upper crust. I stood in the grand foyer, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was not wearing my threadbare cardigan. Alexa had taken me shopping, an early advance on the recovered funds, and I was wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue pantsuit that made me feel like armor had been forged specifically for my skin. Beside me stood Grandfather Andrew, leaning on his silver-tipped cane, his posture rigidly straight. He wore a classic black tuxedo, his jaw set in a line of absolute, uncompromising stone. On my other side were Alexa, radiating professional menace, and a very large, very polite man named Thomas, who happened to be a licensed process server. "Are you ready, Eva?" Grandfather Andrew asked, his gravelly voice barely audible over the din of the party. He didn't look at me. His sharp blue eyes were locked on the closed double doors of the ballroom. "I am, Grandpa," I replied, my voice remarkably steady. The fever that had plagued me for weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, burning clarity. We pushed the doors open and walked in. For a moment, nobody noticed us. The crowd was dense, mingling around the ice sculptures and the caviar stations. But as we made our way toward the raised dais at the front of the room, the crowd began to part. Grandfather Andrew was a highly respected figure in this city, a master architect whose buildings dotted the skyline. People recognized him. They whispered. They stepped aside. Then I saw her. Evelyn was standing on the stage, tapping a manicured fingernail against the microphone to signal the beginning of her speech. She was wearing a stunning, floor-length crimson gown that caught every beam of light in the room. She looked triumphant, radiant, and utterly invincible. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evelyn purred into the microphone, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "If I could have your attention, please. Thank you all for coming tonight to support our incredible local charities. As you know, giving back has always been the cornerstone of my family's philosophy." "That is a fascinating lie, Evelyn," Grandfather Andrew's voice boomed. He didn't need a microphone. His voice carried the weight of 82 years of authority, cutting through the silence like a thunderclap. Evelyn froze. The manufactured smile on her face shattered, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as she looked down from the stage and saw us standing there. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might actually faint. "Dad," she gasped into the microphone, the sound amplified and panicked. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be resting. You're ill." She frantically waved at two security guards near the stage. "Please, my father is having a medical emergency. Escort him out." The guards took a step forward, but Alexa immediately stepped in front of my grandfather, holding up her leather credential case. "Touch him, and my firm will sue this club into the bedrock," she stated loudly, her voice dripping with venom. The guards immediately backed away, looking to the club manager, who was vigorously shaking his head, wanting no part of this. The entire ballroom was dead silent. 400 of the city's wealthiest people were staring at the stage, their champagne glasses suspended in midair. "I am not ill, Evelyn," Grandfather Andrew said, slowly ascending the 3 small steps to the stage. He stood right beside her, towering over her despite his cane. "And I am not confused, but I am deeply, profoundly ashamed." "Dad, stop it," Evelyn hissed under her breath, trying to grab his arm. "You are embarrassing yourself. You are ruining everything." "You ruined everything the day you decided my granddaughter's future was yours to steal," he replied, turning to face the crowd. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, many of whom were his former clients and friends. "My daughter, Evelyn, invited you all here tonight under the guise of philanthropy," Grandfather Andrew announced, his voice echoing with devastating clarity. "She presents herself as a successful consultant, a woman of means. But the truth is, the very dress she is wearing, the car she drove here in, the money she used to rent this very room, it is all stolen." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. People began whispering frantically to each other. Evelyn stumbled backward, dropping the microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a deafening screech of feedback that made people wince. "He's lying," she shrieked, pointing at me. "She poisoned his mind. Eva is a pathological liar. She's mentally unstable." I walked up the steps and stood next to my grandfather. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked directly into my mother's panicked, darting eyes. "If I'm lying, Mom, then you won't mind explaining the documents Thomas brought for you," I said calmly. I gestured to the process server. Thomas walked up the stairs, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase. He held them out to Evelyn. "Evelyn," Thomas said politely, "you are being served. These are civil suits for fraud, grand theft, and breach of fiduciary duty, filed on behalf of Eva and Andrew. Additionally, notice is hereby given of a temporary restraining order, freezing all assets associated with Golden Oak Holdings, LLC, and your personal bank accounts." Evelyn stared at the papers as if they were a coiled snake. She refused to take them. Thomas simply dropped them at her feet, the pages scattering across the polished wood of the stage. "5 years ago," I said, my voice projecting clearly into the silent room, "my grandfather transferred a $500,000 commercial property to me to secure my future. Evelyn intercepted the deed, forged my signature, and created a shell company to hide it. She has been collecting my rent ever since. Furthermore, she fraudulently took out a $250,000 loan against the property to fund her luxury lifestyle." "Shut up," Evelyn screamed, covering her ears like a petulant child. "Shut up, you have no proof, you have nothing. You are a useless little girl who just wants to destroy me because you're jealous. The forensic accounting report is filed with the court, Evelyn," Alexa called out from the floor, holding up a copy of the thick binder. "We have the routing numbers, we have the traced signatures. The bank has already been notified of the fraudulent loan." Grandfather Andrew turned to Evelyn, his face a portrait of absolute sorrow and unyielding resolve. This was the moment she had always feared, the moment the manipulation failed. "You are no longer my daughter," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, quiet register that somehow carried further than a shout. "I have contacted my estate attorneys. You are entirely removed from my will. You are stripped of your power of attorney. You will not receive a single cent of my legacy. You are on your own, Evelyn. Let's see how well you survive without feeding on your family. Evelyn looked around the room. The faces of her friends, the socialites, the country club elites, the people she had spent her life trying to impress, were staring back at her with open disgust, horror, and judgment. She had been exposed in the one place she valued above all others, the court of public opinion. She let out a ragged, desperate sob, a sound utterly devoid of her usual polished grace. She hiked up her crimson gown, stepped over the scattered lawsuits, and practically ran off the stage. She fled through the side exit, disappearing into the cold winter night, leaving behind nothing but the shattered pieces of her fraudulent empire. I stood on the stage, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of 28 years of emotional abuse finally lift from my shoulders. Grandfather Andrew reached out and pulled me into a tight, fierce embrace. For the first time in my life, I wasn't cold anymore. The justice system, often slow and cumbersome, moves with terrifying speed when presented with an airtight forensic accounting report and undeniable evidence of felony forgery. Within 48 hours of the country club gala, Evelyn's bank accounts were completely frozen. The illusion she had maintained for years evaporated overnight. I sat in Alexa's office a week later, sipping a cup of actual, premium coffee, listening as she read through the latest updates. "The bank moved to seize the Merceds this morning," Alexa said, a deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips. "She defaulted on the commercial loan payments because we froze the LLC accounts. The bank is initiating foreclosure proceedings on her mansion. Since all her assets were tied up in the stolen property and the fraudulent credit lines, she literally has nothing liquid. She can't even afford to hire a defense attorney." "What will happen to the Oak Street property?" I asked, a lingering trace of anxiety still residing in my chest. "We filed an injunction to halt any action against the property itself, proving the loan was taken out fraudulently without the legal owner's consent," Alexa explained, tapping her pen against the desk. "Because we proved your signature was forged, the transfer to the LLC is legally void. The deed reverts directly back to you, free and clear. The bank will have to go after Evelyn personally for the $250,000 she spent on designer clothes and spa days." I leaned back in the plush chair, closing my eyes and letting out a long, shuddering breath. It was really over. The nightmare was ending. A month later, the criminal charges were officially filed. Grand theft, felony forgery, and bank fraud. I didn't attend the arraignment. I had no desire to ever see Evelyn's face again. I heard through Alexa that she looked entirely defeated. Her hair unkempt, her designer clothes replaced by standard-issue holding cell attire, the arrogant fire completely extinguished from her eyes. She was facing serious prison time, and the social exile was absolute. Not a single one of her wealthy country club friends stepped forward to help her or offer bail. She had built a life on superficial transactions, and when she went bankrupt, her relationships vanished with the money. Meanwhile, my life transformed in ways I could barely comprehend. With the Oak Street property legally back in my name, the property management company immediately began routing the massive backlog of rental income into a secure trust account Alexa helped me set up. The crushing, suffocating weight of poverty disappeared. I no longer had to choose between heating my apartment and buying food. I didn't have to water down my soup or panic when a bill arrived in the mail. I moved out of the freezing, drafty studio apartment and rented a beautiful, sunlit loft on the top floor of a historic building. It had massive, floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed brick walls, and most importantly, a dedicated studio space with perfect natural lighting. I bought the high-end digital drawing tablets and professional-grade paints I had dreamed about for years. I stopped taking miserable, low-paying freelance gigs just to survive, and started focusing entirely on the art I actually wanted to create. On a bright, crisp Tuesday afternoon in early spring, there was a knock at the door of my new loft. I wiped the charcoal dust from my hands, smiled, and pulled the door open. Grandfather Andrew stood there, leaning on his cane, a warm, genuine smile crinkling the corners of his bright blue eyes. He looked healthier than he had in months. The stress of Evelyn's deception had vanished, taking years off his appearance. Grandpa, I beamed, stepping aside to let him in. You made it up the stairs. The elevator works wonders, my dear, he chuckled, stepping into the massive, sun-drenched space. He looked around the loft, taking in the easels, the canvases, the comfortable furniture, and the sheer vibrancy of the room. He walked over to a large canvas I had been working on, a detailed, intricate landscape of a forest breaking through a storm. He stood there for a long time, studying the brushstrokes, the use of light and shade. This is extraordinary, Eva, he murmured softly, turning to look at me, his eyes shining with pride. You have an incredible gift. I am so sorry it took so long for you to have the freedom to truly use it. You gave me that freedom, Grandpa, I said, walking over and wrapping my arms around him. You always did. She just put up a roadblock for a little while, but we cleared it together. We spent the afternoon drinking tea by the massive windows, looking out over the city skyline. We didn't talk about Evelyn. We didn't talk about the lawsuits or the criminal trial. We talked about architecture, about art, about the future. We talked about the plans we had for managing the Oak Street property together, ensuring it continued to thrive. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden, and profoundly peaceful glow across the loft, I realized that the greatest thing I had recovered wasn't the money, or the property, or the financial security. It was my voice. I had finally learned how to stand up, how to fight back, and how to demand the respect and the life that I deserved. Evelyn had tried to bury me under a mountain of lies and debt, but she had forgotten that seeds need to be buried in the dark before they can grow, break through the surface, and reach for the sun.